What's up, everybody? This is Attorney Davis Younts. I'm here with my law partner, Byrd, and today we are going to be talking about the Me Too movement and its impact on the United States military. We're going to take kind of a look at this from the perspective of the military justice system and how it impacts so much of the work that we do fighting for fair shake for military members. So culturally, I think we all understand the Me Too movement and the impact that it's had, but I just wanted to share a quick story, an example of how far the military overreacted when we talk about the Me Too movement, and then we'll talk about some of the causes of that. So here is an example that just shows how far the military has gone when it comes to the Me Too movement. This was in 2018 timeframe. I was representing a military member of the United States Army who was assigned to Fort Riley in Kansas. This young man was literally facing sexual assault charges because of a butt tap. And I mean, listen, this is the whole story in a nutshell. There was a new troop in the unit. They were going through the process of memorizing tech orders for vehicles that they were repairing. And part of that process is to make sure that people can do it under pressure, under stress. So they'll do things like walk up to the person who's reciting the memorized tech order, and they will yell at them. They will talk to them. They'll get in their face a little bit, not physically harming them. And sometimes traditionally there'll be things like a butt tap or punching somebody in the shoulder, things like that. So literally what happened is my client, an NCO, did a butt tap on this person. It was in no way sexual, not sexual in nature at all, not designed to hurt, embarrass, or degrade anyone. That's not what it was. It was just a tradition. It was the thing that happened to him when he was doing this. And this wasn't even hazing or bullying. This is literally helping people memorize tech orders, things they need to know, steps they need to know under pressure in order to be prepared for combat operations. That case went through an Article 32 initial hearing. I was hired after that, and we literally went to a court martial where my client was facing up to 30 years in prison over what was a non-sexual butt tap. Now, listen, praise God, the truth came out very quickly in that case, and he was fully acquitted of all charges. But the reality was his career was put on hold for almost a year. He went through the entire process of a court martial. He went through the stress and everything else that goes along with it just to have a court martial panel at Fort Riley fully exonerate him. But the reality is, how is it in our military justice system that a case like that would even see the light of day and would even end up at trial? And I will tell you, my opinion as a practitioner is the Me Too movement caused the military to go way too far, to overreact, to jump the shark, and to implement policies and procedures, even just some ways of doing business that are not connected to justice and not connected to the reality of the real world. So, as you know, my background is Air Force. I was a prosecutor and a defense counsel in the Air Force, as well as the chief of the Military Justice Division at the Air Force JAG School. Caleb is a former Army senior prosecutor and also Army defense counsel. And so that's the perspective we're going to bring from this and talk about this. So the first thing I wanted to ask is just a question. And it's sort of a rhetorical question, I know, but I think it's an important question to start, which is, do people lie about sex? And Caleb, I'll let you respond to that. Do people lie about sex?
I'm so confused. I thought we weren't allowed to ask this question.
Right.
I'm going to try to tentatively answer this with the full expectation that lightning will fall from the sky and strike us down for even deigning to discuss this. The answer is yes, and all the time. It's not even uncommon. People lie about everything. I was watching clips from Cat Williams' interview with Shannon Sharp last year, and he had this great statement in there when he talked about liars. And Cat Williams said, he's like, look, liars lie. It's what they do. They don't need a reason. They don't have to have a reason. They don't have to want a reason. We want to ascribe a reason for people to lie about something, but I think that's an inverse of what human nature is. The question is
Mm.
not, whether people lie or why do people lie. The question really is, why does anyone ever tell the truth about anything? That's the real question. And
Right.
when you start approaching these questions from a biblical perspective of we are fallen people in a fallen world, the question no longer becomes about whether people lie. The question becomes, why does anyone tell the truth? So it shouldn't shock us at all to to accept the fact that not only do people lie, they lie about sex, and they lie about sex often.
Yeah, and I think, bringing up the biblical perspective, the example I use, and I listen, people get surprised when I do it sometimes just because they're not used to it. But the common example I use for juries and military court-martial panels is the story of Joseph from the Old Testament, right? Potiphar's wife lied about their interaction, and Joseph ended up spending years in jail, right? So this isn't a new thing that people would lie about sex. And I think part of the problem that we see as we talk about this in modern society is we have this strong desire to recognize that there are evil people in this world who do take advantage of circumstances to fulfill their sexual desires. So there are such thing as rapists. Sexual assaults actually do happen in the real world. It can and does happen. But I think partially what happened in society as a whole, as well as in the military system, we've overreacted, but we have combined two things that should not be combined. We have combined sort of a therapeutic desire, right? Almost a psychological counseling desire to foster a quote unquote believe the victim mentality. In other words, if anybody makes a claim, we're going to believe it to ensure that they get help and to ensure they get the support they need. But trying to combine that with a criminal justice system or a military justice system is very, very dangerous. So what we've seen in the military is not only just a unwillingness to recognize the fact that people might lie, and they might lie about things like sex. We've gone so far as to say, even in military investigations, the default position is not to presume innocence, is not to take the standard steps that should be taken in an investigation to drill down into the truth. The answer is we're simply going to believe the victim. And I could spend days talking about all the negative consequences that has on a military justice system. And that's both for a prosecutor and from a defense attorney's perspective. But one of the biggest things that I saw happen is that we went to the system where criminal investigators in the military, so your CID agents, OSI agents, and NCIS agents, were not allowed to question the narrative they're being told by a complaining witness who is alleging some type of sexual harassment or a sexual assault crime. They're not even allowed to ask hard questions of the complaining witness in an interview. In fact, in order to do what they call a clarification interview, when it's obvious there are problems with the story, they have to go up multiple levels to a regional office in order to ask for permission to do a confrontational interview in the first place. So you have this scenario where this therapeutic mindset of we have to believe anyone and we have to believe anything anyone ever says in order to make sure they get help has seeped into the criminal justice process, so that criminal investigations that should be about finding the truth have nothing to do with that. And they become part of sort of the therapy for a complaining witness in the military system. And that has very, very dangerous consequences. So any thoughts you wanted to add to that, Caleb?
Yeah, and to me, this is the exact inverse of how investigations are supposed to go. Um, and just a little background on what I did in the Army. So I was the special victims prosecutor for Fort Knox, Kentucky. So I managed over 300 sexual assault, rape, and domestic violence investigations while I was there. And the problem is when you start with the mentality that every story I hear is a true story.
Mm.
The problem is, as an investigator, you stop doing the most important thing in your job, which is to corroborate the story, to view it analytically to see if there's anything missing or something that doesn't make sense. Because for me as a prosecutor, my number one job was, how do I develop this case to have enough evidence to prove my case beyond a reasonable doubt, such that I can keep and sustain a conviction, right?
Right.
Well, when the investigator stops with, "Oh, well, we got the story," that's not good enough. That's not evidence. That's not going to get me to the standard I need. And so what we saw constantly were investigators who didn't want to do the second, third, fourth steps in an investigation because, oh, well,
Right.
I got a story. It doesn't really matter that no one corroborates it. It doesn't really matter that there's no eyewitnesses. It doesn't really matter that she's now told the same story 5 different ways.
Right.
And so this was something I was constantly battling as a prosecutor, was even just trying to get the investigators to do a full, complete investigation and not just go off of the word of someone who typically had a motive to lie.
Right. No, and I think that part of what that has done in the military system is it's created uh, negative incentives to doing the right thing, and that's what I want to kind of talk about. So we talk about incentives for a second. In the military system, the decision maker, and this is changing, but I want to talk about what we have dealt with for the past 2 decades, which is the military has created a scenario where if a prosecutor in the position that you were in, or a commander that's making a decision about whether or not charges are going to be brought and a case is going to be going forward to trial, they have an incentive, in my opinion, to take every case to trial in the military system. That was the incentive that was in place. And here's why I say that. I can give you story after story of general officers, of senior commanders, of other individuals that were fired, that lost their jobs. I can give you examples of JAGs, staff judge advocates, that were fired because of a perception that they were soft on these cases, or that they weren't being aggressive enough in going after these cases. And so what it created is a scenario where commanders would push a case forward to trial, JAGs would push a case forward to trial, even though no one really thought it should go forward to trial, but they were afraid of the CNN effect. They were afraid of Senator Gillibrand. They were afraid of being under a perception that they were being soft on this. And there were multiple times of people who were unjustly fired from senior positions because they did the right thing in a case, and there was blowback. And the idea was, well, why didn't this case go to trial? So again, I could give a lot of examples of that, but I think it's important that people understand from a command structure standpoint, the system was driven in such a direction that you have cases that should not be going forward to trial. And the reality that so many people who would push for the Me Too movement miss is it is a very, very unpleasant thing for the victim of a sexual assault to go through the investigative process and to go through a trial. And it does no one any favors when someone is put up on the stand as a complaining witness, subject to cross-examination from someone like you or I, and what's going to be demonstrated is that they are a liar, that they were lying about things and covering things up, and perhaps had an incentive to lie. And so, I've seen that over and over again, where no one warned this complaining witness what it was actually going to be like to be cross-examined in a courtroom in front of a court-martial panel by a skilled attorney that had actually done their job and expose all of their lies for the world to see. And there was not honest feedback for them. There was no disincentive for them moving forward because of the way the system was built. And we see that over and over again. Even this week, there was a couple of cases we've been talking about. I don't know if you wanted to hit on those, of outside of the military system, of women coming forward and admitting years after the fact that they had lied about sexual assault.
Yeah, there were 3 that we were just talking about a minute ago. Obviously, in the last couple of weeks, the complaining witness in the Duke lacrosse case came out and admitted this week that she made the entire thing up. We saw just literally this week a former 5-star prospect coming out of high school who was, I mean, he was set. He was going to go play college football, barring an injury. Those 5-star players are always going to go to the NFL. He had his entire career. Uh, to make millions of dollars for his family and his future, completely destroyed because someone made a false accusation. And she came out this week and admitted it was false. There was a punter in the NFL who missed an entire season basically going through litigation for what turned out to be a false claim. And so these are just some, I would say, high level public examples of things that you and I have seen numerous times, particularly in a military setting, that has now created perverse incentives for people to make false claims because they're not going to get scrutinized, they're not going to get questions, and they're going to get military benefits regardless of whether the claim is true or not.
Yeah, so I want to dig down into that, just especially for some of our audience that's not as familiar with the military system. This is a huge problem right now throughout the military. It's a particularly significant problem at the military service academy. So what has happened, particularly during the Obama administration and then the last 4 years, is that a series of incentives have been put in place. The stated intent of those incentives was supposed to encourage people who are actually victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse to come forward and report it within the military structure. The problem is, just like anything else the government tries to fix, when you're not doing it from foundational biblical justice principles, you create these incentives and there are people that will take advantage of them. So, very simply, there is this idea of safe to report policies. In other words, you could be an Air Force Academy cadet, you could be a Naval Academy cadet, you could be at West Point, and you could be participating in a prohibited activity. But if you report a sexual assault, you get a get out of jail free card. You won't be disciplined for your own misconduct. So let's just say there's a situation where there's a party involving underage drinking. People get caught, people show up drunk and get caught. If there's someone who is part of that, group of people who gets caught that comes out and says, yeah, but during this party, I was sexually assaulted, they get a get out of jail free card, regardless of the veracity of their statements, regardless of even really any prosecution or anything else that happens from it. They get this get out of jail free card. And that's just step one.
And by the way, can I just add to this? When I was a prosecutor, this drove me insane. And part of the reason it drove me absolutely crazy is because, you and I spent a lot of time doing defense work. That's what we do now. You're just handing defense cross-examination questions at that point. What I wanted to do
creating
is
a motive to lie.
Yeah,
You're creating a motive to fabricate by having a policy that's not consistent with justice, and there are other ways to handle it.
That's right. And because what I wanted to do as a prosecutor, because usually a lot of these things were mostly benign, it was things like underage drinking, right? And
Right.
so what I wanted to do as a prosecutor is, hey, let me give her an Article 15. Let me give her some minimal punishment for
Right.
this underage drinking. And then now when she takes the stand, I can actually use that to bolster her a little bit. Like, yep, I was drinking, I was underage, I got punished for it, I took my licks, and then I've completely taken the wind out of the defense's sails. So when Congress made this change, at the time I was a prosecutor, I was like, you got to be kidding. Like, this is
Right.
absolutely just handing the defense material.
Well, you're turning everyone in the military system who's complaining of sexual assault that had their misconduct, you're essentially turning them into a snitch, right?
That's
Like
right.
you're creating
That's
a
right.
scenario where they're a snitch, even though that's not necessarily the right thing to do. And there are reasonable ways to handle things like, a breaking of a curfew or underage drinking that could be handled appropriately and don't have to end a military career. There can be, an element of mercy and grace in that, but it still needs to be addressed. It doesn't take away that misconduct. The other thing that we have seen, and this is where it gets wild and it just sort of gets worse and worse, is you have these policies that are in place that no one thinks through. Again, I think we've merged the therapeutic with criminal justice, but the problem is you have a scenario where someone who's in the military and claims they were sexually assaulted while serving in the military is automatically going to be considered for post-traumatic stress disorder or military sexual trauma disability ratings. So you have a scenario where anyone who complains of a sexual assault in the military, as long as it's documented that they made a complaint, doesn't even have to result in prosecution. Nothing else has to come of it. But if they complain and they say, while I was on active duty in the military, I was sexually assaulted, they're looking at a minimum of a 40% VA disability rating and potentially 100% VA disability rating for the rest of their lives, tax-free money coming into them because they claim that an interaction was not consensual. Just on that basis alone, they're setting themselves up for what may be, $500,000 or more over a lifetime of benefits. And again, I've had cases, I know you've had cases, but I've literally defended cases where that was the motive. And I actually was able to prove it because the complaining witness was lying about seeking an outside consultation and seeking those VA benefits and tried to cover it up. So, those things actually do happen. Take it a step even further. And when you talk about incentives, you also have this idea within the military system. People now understand in the military system, if you say you were the victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, the military system is bent over so far to believe the victim that they will not even properly investigate it. So now military spouses, former military spouses, are making, allegations of spousal rape or abuse and using that to benefit themselves in divorce, child custody proceedings. And it's resulting in cases going to trial, general court martials going to trial against military members for absurd allegations that clearly the motive was simply to gain an advantage in divorce or custody proceedings. But as soon as the military charges this person, then the civilian courts, think of this person as, a sex offender, and they act accordingly when it comes to these divorce and child custody decisions. And again, I've had multiple cases where that fact pattern is exactly what's happened. So you see what I call a weaponizing of the system in order to gain an advantage, whether it's a financial advantage, VA disability benefits, a career advantage, or to gain an upper hand in divorce and custody proceedings. That's the scenario. That's the system that's been created in the military.
Well, and one of my favorite people I ever worked with at Trial Defense Services, you and I both worked with her. She had a great phrase. She called this the victimizer 3000, right? Of it doesn't matter what your career was like. It doesn't matter whether you were a truthful person. Doesn't matter whether you were admired or hated in your unit. Doesn't matter. As soon as you claim sexual assault, we put you in the victimizer 3000. We crank the handle, and you come out a beautiful snowflake.
Right.
And it's these kind of things that create the perverse incentive, which to me, the real frustrating thing is the problem with these perverse incentives is it undermines a real victim's opportunity for justice because
Yes.
it poisons the jury pools. It poisons the investigations. And when that happens, I had some cases at Fort Knox that we developed and prosecuted that were absolutely horrendous. True victims who were actually raped and abused over periods of years, right?
Yes. And I
Horrible,
prosecuted some
horrible.
of those cases as well.
It was harder for me to get justice for those actual victims because of the perverse incentives that we had created, that Congress had created, that were allowing these false or at a minimum unprovable claims to go to a court martial.
Well, one of the things I saw was at the Air Force Academy when I was a prosecutor there. There had been so much heat, a whole bunch of people had been fired, and other things had occurred. So every single case, even old cases with no merit, were being brought up and being brought to trial. And what actually happened at the Air Force Academy is the court martial panels were skeptical. I mean, no one that was stationed at the Air Force Academy that was on these court martial panels really wanted to have anything to do with these allegations because they had seen multiple allegations that were so absurd and so ridiculous. They were very, very skeptical of any case being brought forward to trial. And so again, that's not what we want in the system. So we have seen some changes, right? So we have seen a little bit of change. Some authority has been taken, a lot of authority has been taken out of the hands of commanders and put in the hands of what we call the Office of Special Trial Counsel, OSTC. And I've talked about that before, but what do you think we're going to see? How much do you think that's going to help as we kind of look into the future and think about what's next?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about how the Army OSTIC was developing out. So, um, when I became a special victims prosecutor in 2021, I was at a training. General Mendelsohn at the time was giving an open forum discussion about these changes that were happening, and he just kind of picked me out of the crowd, and we were talking about the Army's conviction rate for these cases.
Right.
At the time, there was a big study from the Defense Armed Services Committee that had come out that showed the Army was batting below the Mendoza line. They were getting like 19-20% conviction rates on these cases. Well, I in that training, I told General Mendelsohn, I was like, look, if you want to get to an 80-90% conviction rate, which is the standard for every prosecutorial jurisdiction in this country, I can get you
Right.
there, but you're not going to like the way I do it. And
Right.
I absolutely got excoriated in this meeting. How dare you say that we shouldn't bring these cases? How dare you not want these victims to have these therapeutic moments in a courtroom to face their accuser? Because the incentive that you hit on earlier at the time, under when the commanders were still referring these court cases to court martial, no commander was ever fired for referring too many court martial cases.
That's right.
They were terrified of not of refusing to send a bad case to court martial, and then Senator Gillibrand sending their office a letter, or CNN giving their PAO a call. Well, when the transition to
Listen, I will tell this story to anyone that will listen, but I had a case exactly like that at Dover Air Force Base. I literally had an NCO, an Air Force NCO, accused of sexual assault, go to trial, be fully acquitted at trial. And I walked out, and the commander was there waiting for me to shake my hand.
It's insane.
Saying, this is why I sent this case to trial, because I knew he would win. I knew he would be exonerated. And I'm so glad that happened. And I wanted to punch the guy.
It's
because I
manifestly
thought,
evil.
that is absolutely evil. That's an abuse of the process. And that was fundamentally unfair to your NCO. And the reality is that was not true. That was the narrative you wanted to create now, because you had lost the faith of your troops, because they all knew this was a fabricated story. They knew it. Everyone knew it. There were eyewitnesses. It was a fabricated story, but it still went to trial because this commander was so afraid of losing their job and so afraid of that perception that they went forward and then tried to act like that was a good thing later, which again, that's where I start to get fired up about these things. So sorry, I'll let you finish your thought there.
No, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think we've both seen some very similar examples of this. And it's part of why you and I are so frustrated over the way these things are handled. So now that they've created the Office of Special Trial Counsel, they've taken prosecutorial discretion away from the commander and put it into the hands of lawyers, which, look, this is how every prosecutorial jurisdiction in America runs, other than the military until recently. But the problem is, it fundamentally undermines the nature of the military.
Right.
I'll give you an example. When I was a young captain, the best leader I ever worked for in the Army, absolutely legend of the JAG Corps. I deployed with him. I sat next to him. He was my colonel on deployment. I sat 3 steps from this guy for 6 months. Phenomenal guy. And the thing he told me was, in our first meeting together, he said, "Caleb, you have to remember, JAGs do not decide. You
Right.
advise, you advocate, you don't get to make decisions. And the minute you start putting yourself in the position of the decision maker, you have lost what it means to be a JAG."
Right.
And now that we have taken that discretion away from commanders, we put it into OSTEC. I have big concerns about how this is going to go, because it's inverting the role of the JAG in the military.
Well, and here's my problem with it. I think part of the nightmares that was created, that even warranted creation of the Office of Special Trial Counsel, was poor lawyering by the JAG Corps.
To start
Meaning,
with,
good JAGs properly advising commanders would have gone to the commander and done things like I did as a prosecutor and said,
right.
"Boss, this case should not go to trial. I do not feel ethically and morally comfortable trying this case. Our chances of winning are very low. And if we do win, I'm not sure that's the right outcome. but I will put that in writing and I will put my name on it. I'll put my license on the line. I'll put my reputation on the line to put that in writing. So even though you're making the decision, you can say to anyone who asks, I relied on the expertise and the opinion of my counsel. The problem is, just like commanders were afraid to do that, Jags were terrified to do that because
Terrified.
they didn't want to get fired. They didn't want to be perceived on the wrong side of, political wins or other things. And so you had the exact same disincentive for the Jags. So in my opinion, in part, this is a problem created by Jags. And what's the solution to the problem? Put
More
Jags in charge
Jags.
of it.
That's right.
Right. And that does fundamentally undermine the military system. So I do think we may see less court-martial prosecutions when we have this Office of Special Trial Counsel, because the standard they're supposed to be evaluating these cases from is there a reasonable likelihood of success at trial? And again, we can talk about whether or not that's the right moral and ethical standard. But the idea is, if we're going to go to trial, we want to win so our numbers look better. That's a cynical, I know, analysis of it, but we will see less cases because the prosecutors aren't going to want to move forward on cases they don't think they have a chance of winning. But again, you're bringing this all up to an office that could be highly politicized. You're putting Jags in charge of a problem I think they were mostly responsible for creating. And then here's the thing. The Army's Office of Special Trial Counsel program, the first person that was selected to run the program was a very good man, someone I know who I worked at the JAG school with, who was selected for that position because of his experience, probably one of the most effective, experienced litigators in the Army. And he was immediately fired before he could even move into the position and do anything, because decades before, when he was a defense counsel, he had said things like, sometimes victims or people who complain of sexual assault are not telling the truth, and it is our responsibility as defense counsel in the Army to fight to ensure they get a fair trial. And that was used against him. So I just asked the question, who then are we putting in charge of these offices? And are they people that are actually going to be motivated to do the right thing, or are they going to simply buy into a therapeutic rather than a justice-based mindset for all of this? So any other thoughts on OSTIC or kind of that change?
I have two quick thoughts on that. First of all, I don't think it's likely that OSTIC becomes politicized. I think the purpose of creating OSTIC was to politicize it. The OSTIC is a direct reporting agency in the JAG Corps. The lead stick reports directly to Congress. And this is not an exaggeration what I'm about to say. What that means is the lead stick and the OSTIC organization is outside of the JAG Corps. It is not
Right.
under the control of TJAG, which is insane.
Right.
So it is an independent direct reporting agency within the Army that goes straight to Congress. It was very clear to those of us who knew him, because as you were saying, the original lead stick for the Army, someone I knew personally, he had the reputation of being one of the most morally upstanding men in the entire JAG Corps,
Yes.
who was removed because he dared to disagree with what Congress was doing. And it was
Right.
clear from the beginning there was a smear campaign on the inside to try to get rid of him in that organization. But the second thing I will say is I think what you're going to see short term is fewer and fewer of these cases going to court martial because of the political pressure that's going to be put on this
To win.
organization. Well, number one, to win cases, which you can't be a prosecutor and bat below them and doze a lot. Okay,
Right.
you have to win 80 to 90% of your cases.
Right.
When I first started practicing criminal defense law, my mentor here in Alabama, he told me, he said, Caleb, as a defense attorney, you should lose 80% of your cases and win about 20. Prosecutors should win about 80 and lose about 20. And if those numbers get too far from that, one or both of you are not doing your job very well. So prosecutors need to be evaluating their cases from the perspective of, can I get a conviction and sustain it? That should be the
Right.
question. But the
Right.
problem is going to be the Army's going to get to that 80% conviction rate. and Congress is going to be furious because
Right.
to get there, they're going to have to take about a tenth of the cases that they've taken over the last decade, and Congress is absolutely going to lose their minds over it, regardless of what the winning percentage is.
Right. Well, and listen, just to put that percentage into critical context, right? In my time, almost 2 decades as a defense attorney, both inside the military and outside the military, of cases that went to trial, there were only 2 times where my client was convicted
Yeah,
of sexual assault, and both of those cases were overturned on appeal. In
right.
other words, you talk about the Mendoza line. My record as a defense counsel was not losing a sexual assault case. Again,
Yeah,
2 were overturned on appeal,
yeah,
and that's it. So, I mean, that just tells you there is a fundamental problem with the system because, again, we do our job. We're very passionate about our job, but that is not normal, right? That's
no,
not
it's
what
not.
the system is supposed to look like normally. So what I want to say, I just want to talk about the implications of one of the negative consequences of what's going to happen with OSTIC, I predict, and I'm already seeing it. You're already seeing it. But here's the
Yeah,
reality. And this, again, maybe I sound cynical, but this is almost funny to me. Okay. So we have a problem that I think a lot of it stems from JAGs not giving good advice and being willing to take accountability for the advice they're giving to commanders. So commanders were moving all these cases to trial. Congress doesn't like it because there's not enough wins, and so they set up this Office of Special Trial Counsel. They take authority out of the commanders. But here's what's happening and what's going to happen. The Office of Special Trial Counsel is going to say, okay, 90% of these cases we don't want to take to trial. Guess what happens with those cases? The cases they don't prosecute get sent back to command to deal with.
yep,
So now you're a commander. You have a case that might actually be a real sexual assault case, but for whatever reason, an evidentiary reason or otherwise, OSTIC doesn't think they could win at trial. And so now you're a commander and your tools have been taken away. You can't prefer charges. You can't
yep,
refer charges to a court martial, and you can't do an Article 15 non-judicial punishment because the military member could turn it down. So now you're stuck dealing with things like administrative reprimands and potentially discharge boards to deal with that. So that's not a good situation for the command. On the other side, that's not a good situation for our clients because even though we can win discharge boards, I won a sexual assault discharge board last week in Maryland that was absurd, and no one wanted to prosecute it. That's why it went to a discharge board, but it's due process light. It's a lower standard. It's not a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. You don't get full discovery at a discharge board. So it's an entirely different kind of litigation that isn't really designed for crimes, felony level sex crimes, but that's the reality. So it's not good that we end up in a scenario where this direct reporting organization, direct reporting to Congress, is just going to kick back cases to command. Commanders aren't going to have the tools they used to have. And then I think that's going to hurt a lot of military members if we're not careful and they don't have good representation, because they're still going to be labeled as a sex offender, even though they never had their day in criminal court. So I'm not excited. And I know Caleb knows this. I'm not excited about this solution. I don't think it's the right approach. So what I want to do now is I just want to talk briefly about some biblical concepts and just some solutions. I have some thoughts, but what's the good news, or what's the hope? What's the optimism from the future from your perspective, Caleb? How should we be analyzing this as Christians? How should we be looking at this as practitioners?
Well, when it comes to how to address this from a biblical worldview, the Bible gives us a clear map for how to handle criminal cases. And it really starts with the Ten Commandments admonition of do not lie, right?
Right.
And then the way the case law in Deuteronomy applies that principle is actually in a positive and a negative way. In the positive way, it's you will tell the truth. If you are a witness, you have a duty and an obligation to come forward. Um, but specifically related to criminal allegations, the Bible is very clear. If you lie and if you make false accusations, you are liable for the punishment that the true victim, the person you lied about, would have received if convicted. Um, And this is a really, truly important biblical principle that we've gotten away from here in the West. Uh, spec- Specifically in the military, I saw multiple cases where we had a victim, an alleged victim, who had made provably, demonstrably false claims. I saw this multiple times. I encouraged the commander multiple times to press charges against this person for making false official statements and perjury, and the commands wouldn't touch it. Did not matter
Right.
what evidence I put in front of their desk. And so this is a principle we've gotten away from that has to be restored if you're going to build trust back into the judiciary system related to these cases.
Right. Well, here's my problem too, and I'll speak to this because I think it goes to the other side. When we look at these cases, there is also a biblical model for evidentiary standards, right?
That's right.
And you might hear it's called the two witnesses standard, as how it's been said. And some people sort of take that out of context and be like, well, in what sexual assault case ever will there be two witnesses to a sexual assault? I think that's a limited analysis. Two witnesses, in my mind, practically speaking, could be two forms of evidence. In other words, you could have a statement, a clear, consistent, viable statement from a complaining witness, and in addition to that, you could have other corroborating evidence. You could have DNA evidence. You could have physical injuries. You could have confessions or incriminating actions after the fact that would be a second independent basis, not just a single statement, a second independent basis on which to make a life-altering decision for someone who's accused of a heinous crime. So listen, I'm a defense attorney, but I think that rapists and child molesters should get the death penalty.
Same.
Right.
Yep.
That's what I believe. But I also don't believe they should be convicted unless there is credible evidence from two independent sources that come together. And really, I don't even think we should be trying to push forward cases without that to trial. There are other ways to deal with that. So, I think that's the context, but the military system has gone so far as there's an instruction that's read to court-martial panel members that says, sufficient evidence may be just the story you've heard alone. You don't need any independent corroborating evidence by itself. Just the story alone can be enough to reach a beyond the reasonable doubt standard and convict. And that's directly inconsistent with biblical principles. So I think one way to solve this, and it won't happen overnight, but we can return to biblical principles. We can say, look, this is a system where if you are a liar, if you are using this allegation, regardless of the type of allegation that it is, in order to benefit personally, and it is a false allegation, there may be real consequences for you. I mean, again, how do you make someone whole? Back to your example of a 5-star recruit, someone who had the potential to play in the NFL, 10 years of life ruined, and then 10 years later, the complaining witness, the evil person who made up this allegation, is just like, yeah, gee whiz, sorry, I did it because I thought I could make millions off of it. I mean, this individual, their family, their future, everything this person worked for their entire life was destroyed and taken away from them. And every time you have a story like that happening, it's much harder to get a conviction and actually punish real rapists and real sex offenders. And so it has that negative consequence. The other thing I will say, and this is the part that will get us canceled and be controversial.
Wait, we haven't gotten there yet?
We're probably pretty close. But here's the thing. I mean, the other thing we need to look at in the military system is the idea of having women in combat units, in combat roles, right? I mean, the reality is we're introducing, when we have two genders in an austere environment, in a combat situation, thousands of miles away from anything else, you are creating unnecessary risk and you're creating unnecessary complexities that come with having men and women in those kinds of situations, in those kind of living quarters. So, I have no patience I have no sympathy for men in the military that think that their goal in life is to be a pickup artist and take advantage of women. There's no place for that. Women should be the safest in our military when it comes to that. But the reality is, I mean, what happens on college campuses and co-ed dorms every weekend? We've done the same thing in the military. We have co-ed barracks. We have co-ed dorms. We've created a scenario where college-age kids are going to be acting like college-age kids. And we've set up a scenario where we've glorified, getting drunk. We've glorified other things. We've glorified experimenting with sexuality in the military. And then all of a sudden we're surprised when there's a problem with sexual assault. We shouldn't be surprised by that. We need to actually look at those things and take those things seriously. And if we do, we'll start to see some of these problems being solved. So I don't think there is no hope for this, but I do think it's a problem that needs to be analyzed just like everything else from a biblical perspective.
Well, and to your point, I would just like to again reiterate that the law of sowing and reaping is still undefeated, right? Like
that's right.
This is exactly what you should expect to happen when you have co-ed spaces, particularly in combat units in the military. And what it really truly does, it undermines lethality, it undermines readiness, because the simple fact is that most people don't want to accept most men should not be in combat roles. Most men are not physically fit enough to handle the stress of that job.
Correct.
It's supposed to be that way. And so then to undermine standards, to put women into those units to advance a political goal results in exactly what you think it would do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So again, military justice has always been and always will be about good order and discipline, which directly impacts unit cohesion and which directly impacts readiness, lethality, combat effectiveness. So anytime we see something, whatever pressure it is, even if it's just misguided philosophy, and ignoring biblical principles, it leads us down this track. So worldview is destiny. Reaping and, you're going to reap the consequences of what you've done. That's what we've seen in the military. So how I want to wrap this up is I just want to say this. I want to say that there is hope. There are things that are happening under a Trump administration that are a reason to be positive. But the reality is, if you or someone is facing allegations of sexual harassment or sexual assault in the military, you need good legal representation. You need it from the beginning, because everything about your career and everything else is at stake. And it doesn't really matter anymore whether or not it's going to go to court-martial or whether it's going to be handled administratively. There are devastating consequences for these individuals and their families. And the other thing I will say to Christians, particularly to Christian men serving in the military, you need to get your head and your heart right. You need to think about your actions, and you need to be very, very careful about putting yourself in compromising situations. You need to avoid those situations as much as you possibly can, because you're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt in the military system. And you could be, again, like the case I had last week, a combat veteran, an absolutely impeccable record with a reputation that was stellar, to the point you had multiple colonels, 06s coming and testifying as to his character in a proceeding where a stupid allegation of sexual assault that no one believed was a sexual assault resulted in, just a year plus of misery for him. And it really could have impacted his future if we hadn't been successful. So I say all that to say, we cannot forget that God has given us principles and patterns from the Bible that we can apply today. They can be applied in the military. There is hope as long as we return to that and do that. So last thoughts from you, Caleb.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think you and I are both very excited about what we're seeing with the new Trump administration and potential new SecDef. So there's certainly reason for hope, and there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think, the big thing I would encourage anyone who is facing something like this or has a family member who's facing something like this, get an attorney as early as possible in the process. That's only going to benefit you down the road.
Perfect. All right. We'll end there. I hope you feel better. I know you're suffering from laryngitis this week. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening so much. We appreciate it. Feel free to follow us on social media. We'll put those links under the video here. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Take care and God bless.
left to men like Davis Younts fighting for these Navy SEALs.
Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant